Federalist Era is so called because of the fact that when the Constitution was finally ratified by the states, those that had supported the Constitution, those that had defended it from state to state, were known as Federalists. They had written these things called the Federalist Papers in defense of them. And so the fact that the new government has come into power, there's a new president, the result is that many of those people, most of them, a majority of them, are in fact Federalists. That's not to say that the anti-Federalists, those that had argued that the Constitution wasn't written in such a way that it really kind of protected the people because the government was so strong, those anti-Federalists don't retain that name, but they have not gone away. They are still there, and in fact, they are going to be very active in the government as time goes by. We're going to start with Washington's farewell address, kind of an odd place to start, but we're going to start at the end because we want to see exactly what it is that George Washington does as president that really results in this farewell address. So kind of front-loading you here with what he says at the end and what he warns us about. The farewell address basically is a statement not about my success as president but more so, this is what I've learned, this is what I want to warn you about. These are the things that you need to consider as you go forward as a country, and especially for the next president. So the first thing is the preservation of the Union. And what he talks about is that he says, we've got to remember something. We need to avoid what we call geographical discriminations. The idea that Northerners are different than Southerners, that Easterners, those who live along the coast, are different from those who live further inland against the Appalachian Mountains. And now, even in George Washington's time, those that live all the way into the Northwest Territory, way out in what we would call the sticks, in the middle of nowhere, those people are just like everybody else. We're all Americans, remember, he says. Don't look at each other differently just because we live in a different place within the nation. The next thing he mentions in his farewell is that the national debt should not be left to the next generation. That this is an irresponsible act. That when you have a debt, it's your responsibility as a country, as a president, as a Congress, those in power, to pay that debt off and to leave the next generation a clean slate, something that they can work with and not have to bear the burden of your irresponsibility. And this is something that we know today. We understand clearly that the founding fathers set an example. George Washington's made it very clear, but for the most part in our history, we have not followed that example. And today, in fact, we sit with a very large national debt, and the question is, what will we do with it? How can it be paid back? Danger of factions. Now, factions at the time, it's kind of an unclear idea or a concept. It's not really clear in the Federalist Papers what a faction is. Madison talks an awful lot about it. The closest thing we can come to it is essentially like interest groups. I think that it's safe to say that this is sort of like political parties. And the idea is that we do not want to, George Washington warns us that aligning ourselves to a political party and being sort of blindly aligned to them, not really thinking about why we're aligned, or for instance, if we have somebody who is from a particular political party and they have a particular idea, we say, well, I like that idea because they're from my political party. That kind of blind following is not really healthy for the nation. And he warns us that there's danger in this, just like there's danger in geographical discriminations, that neither of these two things, neither of them bring unity to the country. That's the problem. That they in fact divide us more than they unite us. He talks about the importance of a common religion or common morality. The idea that if in fact a people have a firm foundation for their understanding of right and wrong, their morality, and typically we understand that that foundation comes from religion. This is at least what the founding fathers firmly believed, that those who would go to church, those who practice their religion, whatever that religion might be, would have a greater sense of right and wrong, and obviously an understanding, at least from their point of view, that there were consequences to misbehavior that beyond even, for instance, their family or government. But more importantly, that the importance of that is this, that if a people are well grounded in their morality and they follow those rules of right and wrong very closely, there's less of a need for government to tell them what to do or how to do it. And we see, for instance, over time that as people have walked away from that religious foundation, that they have walked away from attendance to church, and we see far fewer Americans doing this. We've seen the number of laws in our country grow. We need, the understanding was that one way you'll have a master. You'll either have a master and the morality based on your religion will dictate to you what you should do, or you'll have a master and that is it's going to be government. And if you want to maintain your freedom, he says, you want to make sure that you have that firm foundation of morality. Because when you begin to lose that, government will step in, and they'll tell you what's right and wrong, and they'll tell you what to do, and essentially you've lost your freedom. Relations with other nations. He's going to have some experiences his time as president that he's going to find that other nations, well, as much as you might want to stay at home and kind of mind your own business, relations with other nations sometimes can draw you into some serious problems. And so when it comes to other nations, what he says is, look, we've got to maintain a healthy respect for all other nations. We've got to have this intent that we're going to treat them fairly, that we're going to treat them with the utmost honesty, that we want to do business with them, and again, make sure that that business is on the up and up. At the same time, we've got to make sure that when we create alliances, when we are taking the time to make agreements with other countries, in particular those that involve military support or defense, we've got to make sure that we are wording that and choosing those, the way we set that up very carefully, because one of the problems that Washington finds himself in is that that treaty with France from the Revolution, the Treaty of Alliance, is going to have a pull on him and drag him into a situation where he feels, well, at least he somewhat feels compelled to assist the French. And the French are demanding it because of the treaty we have. But at the same time, George Washington recognizes that that treaty becomes a problem. It is a permanent alliance. It doesn't specify under what conditions we will support the French, in what situations. It just simply says that we will, and that's part of the problem. Limits to a president's number of terms. This is kind of an interesting big thing because he kind of concludes his farewell address by saying, look, I've served 2 terms. I'm done. And he goes on to say that he really believes that going beyond 2 terms, that is not appropriate for any president. And the reason is because he says you essentially become more like a king. You begin to think of your power as something that you've always had, something that you, obviously the people want you to have and want you to use, and the result is, well, you tend to use it indiscriminately. And that borders on tyranny, he says, and that is a serious problem. So as we move now into Washington's time as president, one of the things we want to do is make sure we're kind of paying attention to the farewell address and how his situations, the things that he experiences during his presidency, really are reflected here in his farewell address. The first thing we're going to talk about then is the government under the Constitution begins, and we have, for instance, the first Congress in 1789. We also have the first president, of course, and of course his vice president is John Adams. We also have, for instance, George Washington picking the first cabinet. And so it's important to know the cabinet members and what their jobs are. The first 4 cabinet members, State, Treasury, War, and of course the Attorney General. I really want you to know primarily the first 3, and that is the Secretary of State is Thomas Jefferson. Secretary of the Treasury is going to be Alexander Hamilton. And then the Secretary of War is Henry Knox. Now Henry Knox is kind of that lesser known person, but he was that general that was in charge of bringing those cannons back from Fort Ticonderoga all the way back to Dorchester Heights during the Revolution, dragging them approximately 600 miles through the snow with the help of several hundred men. And that was really kind of an instrumental moment in the Revolution, but he also then became the commander of the artillery for George Washington. So he's a very experienced general, and that's the reason why he's Secretary of War. We also have in 1789 what we call the Judiciary Act. Important to remember that the Constitution says it's Congress's responsibility to set up the courts lower than the Supreme Court, and that power is given expressly in the Constitution 2 different places, actually, in Article 1, Section 8, but also in Article 3. And the result is in 1789, the Congress sets up the judicial court system. And then also we have the first Congress doing something they promised the Anti-Federalists, and that is that they propose a Bill of Rights. And they made it very clear, the Anti-Federalists, that they did not believe this Constitution would protect their rights, and they wanted that Bill of Rights added. There were well over 100 different amendments that were proposed. The Congress whittled those down to 12. The 12 were proposed and sent to the states. Of the 12, 10 were actually accepted, and those became the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, otherwise known as the Bill of Rights. So we have a lot of firsts here as the government begins. Everything is brand new. Everything seems to be, something that, well, we've never done this before, but we're going to give it a try and see how it works. And there's going to be an awful lot of learning going on in the first couple of years of the new government. And having said that, then, everything that Washington does, no one's ever done before. And so this word precedents is really an important word. Your textbook's going to say it's something like a tradition, but it's important to realize that, well, traditions don't start the moment somebody does something. Think of, for instance, something in your family that's tradition. The first time you did it ever in your family, was it a tradition at that moment? It wasn't a tradition until it was done over and over and over again, right? So a precedent really isn't a tradition. It becomes perhaps a tradition, but at first it's just an example that's set. So when Washington does something, it really does serve as an example. Future presidents will look at what Washington did to kind of gauge what they're going to do, and as a result, as they follow that, they are now following the precedent that George Washington set. Now, George Washington's precedents, there's quite a few different precedents. For instance, when he gets elected, he's going to have to figure out what he's going to be called, and they go through a series of different names, Your Highness, His Excellence, and he decides that Mr. President is going to be the proper way to address the president and all future presidents. And so that is adopted. He also chooses to be sworn in on a family Bible. And at the end of his oath, he's going to say, "So help me God." And these two things really are important because every president's done them since then. But what's kind of amazing is they're not written in the Constitution. The actual oath of office just simply says he'll take this oath. It doesn't say that, raise your right hand. It doesn't say use a Bible. It doesn't say, obviously, "So help me God" at the end. These were traditional things that people did because of the fact that when you say, for instance, "So help me God," you're recognizing that, I'm making this oath, and despite the fact that perhaps the people may not recognize when I've broken that oath, because sometimes it's not exactly clear, I do have someone that I answer to that are above the people, beyond the government, that I respond to. In addition to that, George Washington is going to have the first cabinet, and he is going to select those people because he admitted he wasn't the wisest person around, and he didn't have as much knowledge perhaps as he should of the way in which government works, and so he chooses a cabinet as one of the precedents that he sets. So we've already talked about that. He also gives a farewell address. We've already talked about that, and all presidents since then have given farewell addresses. And he also serves only 2 terms, which is, again, we talked about that in his farewell address. But these are all precedents that George Washington sets that all future presidents are going to follow. And as far as the terms go, we followed that very well up until the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt served 4 terms. And at that point, we changed the Constitution. We added an amendment, and we made the rule for exactly 2 terms and no more, because of the fact that George Washington had set that precedent. So one of the first things that George Washington has to deal with is, in terms of the economy, a very serious problem, and the problem is debt. And that debt is a very large debt. The debt at the time was something that was the result, really, of the American Revolution. And at the same time, it was owed to a variety of people. For instance, it was owed to foreign countries like France and the Netherlands and Spain. It was also owed to American citizens. Those American citizens had loaned the American government money, and this is very common during wartime. What Americans had done is they had bought bonds, and bonds are essentially a loan that you make to your government. The government sells bonds, you buy them. So let's say the bond is $100, you buy the $100 bond, the government gets the $100, and you get a piece of paper. Congratulations. That bond, however, the understanding is that bond is worth the $100, and you get paid that $100 back, and bonds will indicate on them exactly what the interest rate will be and how long that interest will be paid for, when the bond matures, when it reaches that point when you can turn it in and get your money back. And so there's all these bonds floating around out there that Americans hold, and those bonds need to get repaid because now we're at a point where our revolution is, well, it's coming on 10 years old, 10 years since it's ended, excuse me. And the result is that Americans are expecting to get paid back. So Hamilton, being the Secretary of the Treasury, his job is to propose solutions. And one of the solutions he proposes is a national bank. The national bank, he says, is going to really be a great place to store the tax revenue. I mean, we have to understand that when we collect taxes, we got to put it somewhere. But he says more than that, the national bank can actually loan money. This is what banks do. They are businesses. He says they can loan money to businesses and farmers, etc. And then when that money is repaid, the interest from those loans will go to pay the national debt. This actually results in a great deal of conflict between Jefferson and Hamilton because of what we'll find out later. But Jefferson has a very different point of view of how government should work. And he says, look, the government's not a business. It's not there to make money in the same sense that a business is. And the bank is an inappropriate way to do business. It's, in his mind, unconstitutional. Hamilton also proposes some national taxes. We're going to find out what those taxes are later on. Those national taxes really are going to be applied to all American citizens as opposed to tariffs. Tariffs are, of course, taxes on imports, and those will be applied to certain goods or perhaps certain countries as they send goods into the United States. The difference is that national taxes, Americans pay these national taxes, whereas in tariffs, it's apparently supposed to be that the foreign countries pay those tariffs. But we got to remember that when a business gets taxed, very often what they do is they turn around and they raise prices in order to pay that tax, which means that the customer technically pays the tax, not the foreign country. And that's something that we've got to consider even today. The last thing that Hamilton proposes is what's called debt consolidation. And so you can see a little chart here that kind of shows if you were a person that had medical bills and credit card bills and car loans, what you could do is you could take all of those bills and put them all together, take out one loan for one amount and pay that one loan off. Now you might think, well, what's the big deal? Why can't you just pay the separate loans? Well, typically it's because each thing has a different amount of interest. The result is that you might be paying a very high interest for your credit card, and a very low interest for your car loan and something in between for your medical bills. And it might be better for you to put them all together at a lower interest rate. And typically, as you borrow more money, your interest rate goes down. The less money you borrow, the more your interest rate is. The result is that your interest rate being lower, your payments will be easier to manage, and that over time you can pay this off easier. Now, Hamilton's idea is not this. Hamilton's idea says, let's assume that these, medical bill, credit card, and car loan are in fact states. So we have, for instance, Massachusetts, and we have New York, and we have Virginia and South Carolina, and we have, of course, Delaware, etc. What if we took the debt from all the different states, because each state has a debt from the Revolution, and what if we put it into one big giant national debt? And this is what we call debt consolidation. The idea, we're going to take all the debts of all the states, put them into one big giant debt, and then the national government will pay this off, of course, with the taxes and the tariffs and so on that they earn over time. Well, the southern states really are very upset about this, and the problem with debt consolidation is pretty simple. When you look at the war occurred more so in the north than in the south. So it was very heavy here. At the same time, it was very light in the south. The result is that the debt in the north is very high, whereas the debt in the south is very low. So for instance, if you're looking at Georgia might have a debt that is less than a half. We're talking about something that's maybe a tenth of the debt of Virginia. And so what Georgia has been told is they're going to take their debt and they're going to turn it over to the national government, and so will Virginia. And then here's the kicker. All the states are going to have to help pay it off. And so if Georgia owed far less than Virginia, the result is now Georgia's debt is going to actually increase, and Virginia's debt is going to decrease. This doesn't make sense to the South. This doesn't seem fair at all. Why should one state have to pay more just because they turned it over to the national government, and another state get a break because they turned it over to the national government? And Hamilton's argument is, well, look, we've all benefited from the war. We've all benefited from the fact that we've won this revolution. We all have freedom, don't we? Well, then we all should contribute to paying off the bill from that. It makes sense, but it's still painful for the southern states. The southern states also have problems with the tariff because they're used to buying very cheap European goods. And those cheap European goods come from a variety of countries. But the fact is that these new tariffs are going to take those cheap European goods and drive the price up. Because, of course, as the tariffs are applied to the goods, the countries will raise their prices for those items, and the Southerners will have to pay a higher price for these goods than they were before. And so the Southerners are very, very upset about Hamilton's ideas. Hamilton happens to come from New York. He's from the northern part of the country. They see this as somewhat of an anti-Southern idea, but at the same time, Hamilton is really bent on making sure that he works with the Southern states to accomplish this. And so the compromise that results is something that Hamilton works out to get the Southern states to approve or accept this idea. And he goes to the members of Congress and he says, look, we've got to build a national capital. We'd like you guys to begin talking about where to put that capital. Begin looking. And he says, I'd like you to look in some of the southern states. We've got some great land down there. And the Congress comes back and says, well, we've got these different places we're looking at. And Hamilton suggests, well, I think we should go for that place that is right in between the state of Maryland and the state of Virginia, with the Potomac River in between. And that's the piece of land that Hamilton wants the government to buy. And he says, look, if we put it there, would you southern states help us with this debt issue? And the southern states comply. They say, if you put the capital in the south, we'll help you with the debt. And the result is that that we'll be able to work this out in the long run. The next issue that we need to talk about is something that happens kind of as a result of Hamilton's proposals, and that is that Hamilton's new tax, his national tax, was in fact on one specific item, and that was whiskey. It turns out that the farmers in the Northwest Territory had a particular issue, a problem. The corn that they grew was difficult to store, and there was no way of getting that corn very quickly and safely over the Appalachian Mountains, and they had to rely upon sending it down the Mississippi through New Orleans and back into the Gulf of Mexico, and then ship it all the way around to states like Virginia and so on. And so this is a very difficult process, and very often corn rotted. It was infested with rats and other rodents. And so what the farmers decided to do was something very simple. They took their corn and they fermented it and turned it into whiskey. And that, of course, they could store in barrels, and they could take their time getting it where they wanted to, and they were making a great deal of money. So Hamilton decides to tax those farmers in the production of their whiskey. Well, the farmers obviously were very upset, and they started something that becomes known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, all this essentially is these are protests, and they are resisting the payment of the taxes. They're not attacking the tax collectors or burning buildings down and things like that, but they're simply resisting. And as a result, when Washington and Hamilton hear about this, the response is going to be very quick. The government sends, under President Washington orders 15,000 troops to go out into the Northwest Territory. He personally leads them, being sort of accompanied by Alexander Hamilton. And when they get there, the farmers quickly disperse and go home, and the whole thing is over. But the important thing here is that Washington makes it very clear that despite the fact that you disagree with things like the taxes, despite the fact that you might not agree with the laws that are passed by Congress, you have representatives in Congress. They make these laws, the president signs them, and then they get enforced. And there's no option here to disobey. There's no option to simply disregard or not enforce these laws. That this is not an option that a state has, that the people have, but in fact, your only option is to obey and then to work with Congress, with your representatives, to get these things changed if in fact you think they need to be. The proof here then is, hey, the Constitution works. It does exactly what it's supposed to. Remember, under the Articles, there was a problem with maintaining, the idea of domestic tranquility, and that was why it was written into the Constitution in the preamble. And this is the first example we see here that Washington uses the government to, in fact, enforce the laws. Now, you might say, well, sending the army? Oh my gosh, we don't do that today. They don't send the army into Los Angeles and enforce laws. But we got to remember something. This was going out into the Northwest Territory. This is not going into a state. And so the territory is controlled by the federal government. It's not controlled by a state government. And the result is that the U.S. Army has complete authority in those territories. Problems with Europe. This goes back to the relations with other countries that was mentioned in George Washington's farewell address. And what is happening in Europe is that the French Revolution begins. It actually begins the same year that the new Congress takes office and George Washington takes office. And the French Revolution really is about the poor rising up against the rich. At the time, the poor in France is probably somewhere around 95%, maybe a little bit higher than that. And the rich, they're really composed of two groups here. The nobility are the rich as well as the clergy. And what happens is that in 1789, the poor rise up against the nobility and the clergy. They actually break into a large prison in Paris, and they let all the political and poor prisoners out. And then they take the nobility and the clergy and they stuff them all into the prison and lock the doors. And then what they do is they, one by one, begin to take these people out, give them what they would call a trial, not really a trial. They would question them, accuse them of crimes, and then they would take them out and cut their heads off. So essentially, the French Revolution becomes an example of revenge. What it is not an example of is what we are very proud of in our own revolution, and that is these people weren't just defending their natural rights and trying to institute a government that would protect those natural rights. They were seeking revenge upon the people that they thought had violated their rights. And this was not something that we did in our revolution. So Washington's not very happy about what he's seeing here. As time goes on, and the French people are using this thing called the guillotine to chop off the heads of people, the nobility. And the guillotine was not just simply a machine that did this, but it was very much it was a spectacle. It was done as a sort of a form of entertainment, I guess, where people were brought in, their heads were cut off, and the crowds cheered, and then they bring in another person and do the same thing. The result is that the countries around France are becoming much more nervous about the French Revolution. Remember, the countries of Europe are just like France. They're controlled by kings. They're controlled by a very powerful clergy through the Catholic Church. And the result is that many of these countries are going to begin to prepare their armies and mass their armies along the borders of France. England wastes very little time. England and France are going to go to war. And this war is primarily a naval war. England's not going to invade France, but they're going to go to war over this whole issue. And the result is that France now becomes very desperate. They're in the midst of a revolution, and they're trying to clean up their government and establish a new one. And at the same time, they're fighting England on the high seas, and they're having problems with this because, of course, they're not well versed in the whole idea of the Navy and how that works. Many of the people that were in the military side with the poor, but we've still got a problem, and that is they don't have the leadership that they need. So what they do is they ask this guy by the name of Genet, and they send Genet over to the United States, and Genet's job really is to recruit Americans to fight with the French. And Genet is going to visit the seaports along the coast of the United States. And what he's looking to hire are people that we call today privateers. And privateers are people that were ship owners and perhaps sailors that are going to sail a private ship, usually probably a ship that was generally used for trade. They're going to outfit it with cannons and guns, etc. And they're going to sail for a country, almost like a mercenary, and they are going to attack the enemy, in this case England. But the deal is that whatever they capture, they get to keep. And this is how they get paid. Essentially, Genet is asking for Americans to become pirates for France. And the result is that when Mr. Genet gets to the point of, as he travels from the southern states up to the northern states, when he finally gets to the point of meeting Washington, Washington has him removed from the country. Washington is very angry with the man and kicks him out of the United States. Well, the damage is already done. These privateers are out in the ocean. They're attacking English ships. And so England responds by impressing American sailors. That is, they begin to attack American ships, and the privateers are attacking English ships. In those battles, when the English ships prevail and they capture the privateers, the crew has gone through, and they're going to pull people out of the crew and make them sail in the British Navy, force them to work on English boats. The main reason for this, of course, is that the English believe, honestly believe that there are some members of the American Navy, of the American, or working on American merchant ships, some of them that are British, that have gone AWOL. They've left the British Navy without permission, and they are now finding employment in the American merchant marine, basically. And the result is that when they get on these ships, they're going to go through the crew, and they're going to question people, and they're going to pull a certain number of them off, and they're going to make them sail for England. So we have this kind of strange situation. We have Americans who are on English ships fighting the French, but we also have privateers who are Americans who are attacking the English where there are Americans. This has all become very confused. And the result is that George Washington says, well, there's only one way to deal with this. We've got to remain neutral. We are going to stay out of this mess. We're not going to get involved. And so he declares neutrality, and the result is that we kind of take a step back, and he's going to encourage Americans. But the damage is already done. These privateers are out there. They're doing their job, and they're rather successful and really ticking England off. And France, of course, is very happy with the situation, but it's created a diplomatic mess for the United States. The last thing we're going to talk then about George Washington is this, and that is that George Washington's going to end his time as president with two treaties, and these two treaties were things that we worked on for several years. One of them is going to be very popular, one not so popular. Jay's treaty is with the British, and the treaty focuses on two issues left over from the American Revolution, one of those being the issue of the Boston Tea Party. The British want to get repaid for that tea. And so what we're asking from the British, if we're going to repay that tea, what we'd like from them is this, and this is the strange part, is that there are still British soldiers who are in the United States. They're actually in the Northwest Territory, that area that is near the Great Lakes, right below Canada. And remember, the British are in Canada, and so there are British soldiers that are in forts in parts of the United States, and they've been there since the Revolution. And we didn't realize this until the Northwest Territory was opened up, and people began to settle there. One of the problems with Jay's Treaty is that it doesn't deal with the issue of impressment. It doesn't talk about impressment at all. And so here, when John Jay and others come back with this treaty, and George Washington hands it over to the Senate, and the Senate approves it, George Washington and John Jay are not very popular people, because Americans, their issue is, okay, what about the issue of impressment? Here you went off and you made all this deal with the British, and you got us paying money, and yep, you're getting rid of people, but the fact is that you haven't dealt with this issue, and there are hundreds of people at this time. By the time we get to 1800, there'll be thousands of people that are working in the British Navy that are American citizens. And this was never dealt with in this treaty. So it is somewhat of a disappointment for Americans, and they are not happy with George Washington at this point. Pinckney's treaty is with Spain, and Pinckney's treaty is very different. We talked about the idea that the people that lived here in the Northwest Territory, the farmers were growing corn, and the corn was difficult to get to market. Well, what they would do is they would take that corn, they would send it down the Mississippi River, and they would get down here. But notice what happens to the Mississippi at this point on the map. Notice that this gray area all belongs to Spain, and so as the Mississippi gets closer to the Gulf, it enters purely Spanish territory. And the Spanish control then the access we have to the Gulf of Mexico. In particular, if you look at the other map, this city right here, which is New Orleans, that as the boats come down the Mississippi, the problem is that the area below New Orleans, this area here is all swamp, the Mississippi Delta. And so what you have to do as a merchant, you have to unload your stuff in New Orleans and move it over here into the what's called Lake Pontchartrain. And from there, you can put it on boats and move it out into the Gulf of Mexico. But the trick is New Orleans. It's controlled by the Spanish, and they are telling us that they don't want us to drop off our stuff anymore. You cannot unload your things here. You do not have the right to deposit. And so what Pinckney's treaty does is it gets us the right to deposit in New Orleans. The right to drop our stuff off, move it to other boats in Lake Pontchartrain, out into the Gulf of Mexico. And the way this actually happens is that is that with Jay's treaty, the Spanish are led to believe that Jay's treaty is in fact an alliance with the British to work against the Spanish, and this is where Pinckney really kind of manipulates the Spanish in letting them believe this whole idea that there's this alliance, which didn't exist. But the result is that we get the right to deposit, and this is something that's beneficial to Americans, American merchants, in particular those that are living in the Northwest Territory. So we're kind of transitioning now into the second part of the chapter about the Federalists, and this part of the chapter is simply called the first political parties. When George Washington is done being president, for the first time we're going to have a real election. We're going to have an actual real moment of, people casting votes and campaigning and all those things that we sort of take for granted today. So we're going to first talk about is the political parties that are set up as a result of George Washington leaving his presidency. So we look at the first two political parties. What we notice is that the Federalists retain their name from that time period as the Constitution was ratified and the Federalist Papers were being written. The Anti-Federalists have changed their names. They're now called the Democratic Republicans. And that name is going to be shortened very, very shortly after this. They're going to just pare it down to just Republicans. But at first, they're known as the Democratic Republicans. The first thing we notice, that you probably should create a T-chart on your notes here to begin listing the different ideas of each of the parties. But the two parties are led by the two most important players in George Washington's White House. Well, although he wasn't in the White House, but his executive department, his administration, and that is Alexander Hamilton on the left for the Federalists, and he is, of course, the Secretary of Treasury, or was the Secretary of Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State. Now, it's something that's kind of important to know at this point, that issue of the national bank, where Jefferson disagreed, was only one issue where Jefferson and Hamilton disagreed, and this disagreement wasn't a light and kind of casual disagreement. It was, in fact, a very hostile disagreement. Jefferson really didn't think that Hamilton was the kind of person that was looking out for the best interests of the American people, and believed that on a regular basis Hamilton violated the Constitution, which Jefferson really kind of looked at as being something that was written in stone and couldn't be changed unless, of course, you were going to have an amendment. And so Jefferson ends up resigning for Secretary of State late in George Washington's time as president, and he leaves the administration and really begins to work against the Federalists in forming this new political party. And the result is we've got some very clear differences between these two groups of people in terms of their beliefs. And so the first thing we want to mention is under the Federalists, that they believe that there was a good reason to believe that the people that were wealthy and educated should be the ones to rule the country. They were the ones who were in the best position. And their argument was, well, look, they have money to protect, they have land to protect, and the result is they will protect property rights. Right? They will write laws that protect property rights. Well, the Democratic Republicans, they didn't disagree, but the problem they saw was that perhaps they would seek to protect their own property rights. And so as much as the Federalists thought that the rich and the well-educated should rule, the Democratic Republicans believed that the average person should rule rather than those who were rich, wealthy, and well-educated. The other thing that, of course, we already know about the Federalists is they believed in this strong national government that was set up, whereas the Democratic Republicans really did believe in what we call states' rights. The idea that the states retain power. The Constitution is something that limits the federal government and allows the states to maintain their power. And so they wanted stronger states rather than a stronger national government. There was an emphasis in the Federalists. They believed that the economy would do better and would grow if, in fact, the businesses were promoted or manufacturing was promoted, whereas the Democratic Republicans believed that the emphasis should be on agriculture and farming. And Jefferson kind of envisioned this country where there was these big rolling hills and farms everywhere and nice big houses and so on. Very much the gentleman farmer, right? That he kind of relaxed on his front porch and watched the work be done as opposed to doing the work himself. But he really did believe in an agricultural economy rather than an emphasis on manufacturing, on business and factories and so on. The Federalists believed that there should be an alliance with the British, whereas the Democratic Republicans thought we should be aligned with the French. Thomas Jefferson was a big fan of the French. Of course, the Federalists believe in the National Bank, and the Democratic Republicans did not believe in the National Bank. They believed that money should be controlled by state banks. The Federalists believe in protective tariffs, those that Hamilton had proposed. And, of course, the Democratic Republicans did not believe that tariffs were the best way to approach things. They believed in free trade, and that is, don't punish countries for bringing things into this country, because then they'll turn around and punish us for bringing things into their country. And that made a lot of sense for a lot of people. The one thing, and the most difficult thing that kind of is the sort of the summation of all this, the Federalists believe in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Now, the idea of a loose interpretation is that when you look at the Constitution, you need to look at it in a way that it sort of enables you to have power. Some people call it not a loose interpretation, but they call it a loose construction of the Constitution. For instance, Jefferson's very critical of the National Bank, and one of the things he says is it's not in the Constitution. Well, Hamilton's response is, well, it doesn't need to be in the Constitution, because the Constitution says the government has the power to collect taxes. We can't just take those taxes and stick them under somebody's mattress or in a closet somewhere. We have to have a place to put them. So he says the National Bank, although it's not in the Constitution, he says, well, it is what we call necessary and proper. And this is the reason why we can do it. Again, the Federalists are stretching the Constitution. They interpret it very loosely. Jefferson's interpretation, his is known as a strict interpretation. He says, well, look, if it's not written in the Constitution, you can't do it. The Constitution has a very clear limit on government power, and if it's not explicitly there, then you shouldn't be doing it. In fact, the states should be doing it, or no one. The people should be doing it, rather than the states or the federal government. And the use of the necessary and proper clause, Jefferson describes as basically as unconstitutional. That this is an extreme exercise, a stretching of the power of the government that should be avoided. And this is a very serious sort of point of contention between these two groups. They do not see each other as properly, adhering to and administering this Constitution going forward. In the election of 1796, the candidates were as follows. We have John Adams and Charles Pinckney. They are the Federalists. And of course, we have Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, and they are the Democratic Republicans. And let's go through really quick and remind ourselves of who these people are. John Adams was the vice president under George Washington. Charles Pinckney was the guy that negotiated Pinckney's treaty. John Adams is running for president, and Charles Pinckney is running for vice president in the Federalist Party. Over here we have Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was, of course, Secretary of State under George Washington. Aaron Burr, he's a resident of New York and a very important political figure in New York, although he's not something currently at this time. Jefferson is running for president, and Aaron Burr is running for vice president in the Democratic Republican Party. Now, Alexander Hamilton, who Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton kind of plays a role here, but it's not as a candidate. In fact, Alexander Hamilton doesn't like Thomas Jefferson at all, right? So he's not going to support him. Turns out Alexander Hamilton doesn't like John Adams all that much either. And so what Hamilton does, being that Hamilton is a Federalist, Hamilton turns around and supports Charles Pinckney, and he works very hard to get Pinckney elected. There's quite a few people, especially Democratic Republicans, that don't like Hamilton, and so the whole idea that you'd support Pinckney, they see not only Adams as a problem now, but they see Pinckney as a problem. And when the election's over, what has happened is that John Adams has been elected president, and his vice president is going to be Thomas Jefferson. So there's this kind of strange thing that happens in the election of 1796. We realize there's a flaw in the Constitution. The Constitution says the person that gets the most electoral votes becomes president. The person who gets the second most becomes vice president. And it makes a lot of sense that we would have the two top vote getters from the two political parties end up as president and vice president. In other words, we have a White House, and John Adams will be the first president to live in the White House. But we have a White House that is made up of two different political parties, which is not going to lend itself, obviously, to working together in cooperation. And this is going to be a problem going forward then in John Adams' presidency. John Adams has to, like George Washington, deal with some problems that are of a foreign nature. And remember, foreign policy is all about how we deal with other countries, how we make decisions, and how we're going to treat them. And we can go back and just review this real quick. The situation is, of course, that we have privateers that are sailing for France. Okay, they are American privateers, but they are working for France. And we know what the British response is. The British response is right here, the issue, or the idea of impressment. Well, then there's this other issue. And that is that we've signed this thing called Jay's Treaty, and the French have gotten into their mind that Jay's Treaty is in fact an alliance between America and the British against the French. And so the French think that there's this alliance, and the result is that the French are now attacking American ships as well. Now, I know this gets really confusing. American privateers sailing for France, attacking British ships. British ships are attacking American privateers. Americans are captured. They're impressed. The French think we've signed an alliance through Jay's Treaty with the British, so they're attacking American merchant ships. And the result is we are now in an undeclared war, in a sense. And John Adams is faced with this situation. John Adams needs to do something. And so John Adams decides to send 3 diplomats over to France and to discuss this issue with the French government, rather than simply sending the American Navy out into the ocean, which there wasn't much of an American Navy in the first place. Maybe that's probably the reason why he decided to use the diplomats instead of sending the Navy. So when they go over to France, they want to talk to a guy by the name of Talleyrand. Talleyrand is the French foreign minister. He is essentially like the Secretary of State for the United States. And when they get to the office where Talleyrand is, the 3 diplomats are asked to do 2 things. They're asked to pay a bribe, and the bribe is tens of thousands of dollars. It's not a small, give us $5 and we'll let you in to see Talleyrand. Tens of thousands of dollars. And on top of that, they're asked to sign a loan from the U.S. government to the French government, the terms of which, meaning how it would be repaid and such, pretty much meant that it didn't have to get repaid for a very long time, if at all. And so these 3 diplomats in this process, they respond by simply saying, we're not giving you a penny. And they walk out. They don't even get to the point of seeing Talleyrand. They've been stopped by the people in the front office, so to speak, like the secretaries, the gatekeepers, which they refer to as agents of the government. They've been stopped by them and told that they have to pay this bribe and this loan, and sign this loan in order to get in to see Talleyrand. And so this whole thing becomes known as the XYZ Affair. The pictures here on the screen really are representative of the way Americans felt at this time. This person here in the middle representing, it looks like Thomas Jefferson, but what you see here is you see on the British side, and notice the chubbiness of it. This is the British Empire. They're very well-to-do. They've got plenty of money and food. But notice how they've got a hold of us, and they're using this stick, kind of a symbol of impressment. And then on this side, we see a Frenchman. The large hat was very customary of the French military, but notice here, going after the money, which is a reference to the bribe. In this picture here, we see our three diplomats, and our 3 diplomats are very nicely dressed and look very polite and respectful and civilized. And then we see the French agents that are asking for the bribe and the loan, and of course they look like a multi-headed monster. The rest of this cartoon, it was really meant to remind Americans this, and that is, when Adams hears about all this, he really begins to think of the French as the enemy. And perhaps the British really aren't the enemy that we thought they were. Okay? And it becomes known as the XYZ Affair because of Adams' feelings when he hears about these three diplomats and what they experienced. He writes about this whole situation, and he has that letter published in American newspapers. He has it sent out to different newspapers, and they publish it for people to read so that the news can get out of what's happened with the French. And in that letter, he calls those agents, this multi-headed monster here, he refers to them as agents X, Y, and Z. And remember, it's not about them. It's about Talleyrand. It's about the French government. It's not about the guys that asked for the bribe. And so this is how it becomes known as the XYZ Affair, because of Adams' letter. But Adams, at this point, really has no choice, and that is he's going to have to focus on securing America, obviously not through diplomatic relations. So in fact, there is what we call a quasi or undeclared war that's going on. Adams is going to ask for an increase in the size of the Navy and the Army to deal with the problem. And we begin spending money on building our Navy and building up our Army and preparing them for what Adams, he's not sure, but Adams knows that there's a naval war going on that we need to deal with. He also asks for Congress to pass two laws, one called the Alien Act and one called the Sedition Act. And the Alien Act was a law that said specifically it gave the president power to jail and then to deport, which means to remove from the country anybody who he considered dangerous, right? The idea of a dangerous foreigner. And of course, the ones that most Americans considered dangerous at the time were the French. So you can kind of see a similarity here to the things that we're experiencing today. And the result is that it's not something that's new, but when you give the president this kind of authority to simply just remove people, the problem is those people have never had a day in court where they've had a trial. They've never had the opportunity to defend themselves and to commit themselves to the United States. And that certainly is a problem. Now, the Sedition Act, on the other hand, was probably even more heinous than the Alien Act. And that is, the Sedition Act made it a crime to criticize the government. It made it a crime to speak or to print or write anything that was critical of the government, whether it was Congress or the president. And because most of the people in the government were Federalists, the result was that most Democratic Republicans saw this as a way to kind of keep them quiet. They saw this was, not just simply that they were trying to protect the people of the United States, as Adams said, but it was more so in a way to keep the Democratic Republicans from voicing their opposition to Federalist policies. Obviously, a violation of the First Amendment, the right to freedom of speech and the right to freedom of the press. And John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, president and vice president, are going to sit down and have several meetings about this. And Jefferson expresses his absolute disappointment in what Adams has done. And makes it very clear. What you've done here is you have sacrificed the people's rights for security. You've given up their rights that they treasure so much, and you've done it all in the name of making sure that they have security and that they're safe. And this is something that Adams says, well, look, this is my number one priority as president, is to keep the people of the United States safe. And if we have to do this temporarily to keep them safe, then it's okay. And this is where Jefferson and Adams absolutely disagree with each other. You've got to find a different way of doing this, rather than taking the people's rights. One of the dangers in government ever doing this, and it's not the last time that this will happen, is that getting those rights back is very, very difficult, and sometimes near impossible. And this is what Jefferson recognizes, that once you give up those rights, or you give the government that kind of power, the government giving up that power and the people getting their rights back usually doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen very quickly. The result is that we get this thing called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. And the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions were a response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. So these were written by Jefferson and Madison, or Madison and Jefferson, and about the Alien and Sedition Acts. And these resolutions, and just so you know what a resolution is when a Congress or a state legislature, they all come together and they make a statement. We believe this, or we think this is wrong, and they sign their names to it. They don't actually vote in a traditional sense, because it's not a law that they're proposing. But these resolutions are a clear statement by a state or by the Congress or by a city council, for instance, that they all agree on something. And so the states of Virginia and Kentucky, they write and agree to these resolutions, and these resolutions basically claim that the Alien and Sedition Acts are unconstitutional, that they should not be allowed, and as a result, they need to be fought against. But more precisely, in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison state very clearly is that states should be allowed to nullify laws. The issue of nullification becomes an important point in these resolutions. And nullification means literally that a state should be allowed to not obey, to not follow, to not enforce laws that they think are unconstitutional. The word nullify means literally to make something powerless, to make it without power, right? To make it void. We might say, for instance, when you write void on a check, the check no longer has any power. It cannot be cashed and used for whatever it was written. So states believe that they have this power. And then they go on to talk about states' rights. And this is where states' rights get somewhat of a bad rap, but and more so obviously during that time prior to the Civil War. But the idea of states' rights here is there's this firm belief on the part of Jefferson and Madison, and expressed in the resolutions, that the federal government's power is limited. And the Constitution is very clear about the limits to that power, and the 10th Amendment in the Constitution is very clear about the limits to that power, and that the government has gone beyond those limits. And the states have the right to stop the federal government when it exceeds those limits. And those rights were not given up with the writing of the Constitution. In fact, states' rights were in fact sort of reinforced with the writing of the Constitution, because it made a very clear separation between the states and federal government, and very clear guidelines as to what the federal government could do and the states were allowed to do beyond that. So the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions really are a result of something that was seen to be as completely unconstitutional. And the controversy is so great that, in fact, John Adams is not going to get reelected. He's got this thing hanging over his head, the Alien and Sedition Acts and the unconstitutionality of them and the violations of people's First Amendment rights that he's going to, and Fourth Amendment rights, that he's going to have to deal with in the next election in 1800.